Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take the sources you send us, and well, we dig into them to pull out the key knowledge.
That's right.
And this time, you've given us a really rich set on the history of Christianity. We've got different documentary perspectives, some critical analyses, the whole sweep from a detailed historical overview.
Yeah, quite a vix.
Our mission here is to kind of summarize the big moments, the themes that keep coming up, and maybe think about how knowing this history could, actually deepen your own faith if that's where you're coming from.
It's a huge topic, but looking at these different angles should be revealing. Let's jump in.
Okay, so starting at the beginning, Jesus of Nazareth.
Right, the central figure. A Jewish preacher, active in Galilee and Judea. Historically, his existence isn't really debated, and the crucifixion around 30 CE is pretty well attested.
But the context is key, isn't it? It wasn't happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. You've got this incredibly diverse religious and political climate. Jewish messianic hope was running high, and his first followers definitely saw him in that light. He was the Messiah they've been waiting for.
And those core early beliefs really stand out. The coming kingdom of God.
A powerful eschatological message.
The idea of the incarnation, God in human form.
Which was radical.
And, of course, the resurrection. That belief seems absolutely foundational.
Transformative, really. Alongside those beliefs, you see the early practices developing, like baptism and the Eucharist, that communal meal.
What strikes you about those earliest communities?
Well, first, how Jewish they were initially. These weren't Gentiles flocking in right away. They met in small groups, often just in people's houses, led by elders, presbyters, bishops. The terms evolved.
And there's a point made about women being quite prominent.
Yeah, that's interesting. The suggestion is that maybe the religious sphere offered them more participation than Roman society generally did. And the growth was pretty rapid, wasn't it? From maybe under 1,000 to about 100 house churches within 70 years or so.
Speaks to the message, I guess.
And the community aspect.
But it wasn't monolithic, right? There were different groups even then.
Right, definitely. You had various Jewish Christian groups, like the Nazarenes, the Ebionites. They kept practicing Jewish law, observing customs, but believed Jesus was the Messiah.
It's fascinating that some scholars think their view of Jesus as a human prophet Messiah, but maybe not fully divine in the later sense, might have had some influence down the line, maybe even on Islam's view of Jesus.
That's a complex thread. And these groups mostly faded out, but the diversity itself is important to note. Then comes a huge event, 70 CE.
The destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem.
A massive turning point. It basically forced both Judaism and this emerging Jesus movement to adapt, to redefine themselves without the temple cult.
How so?
For Christianity, the focus shifted even more strongly to Jesus as the ultimate high priest. His sacrifice is the final atonement. Temple rituals were sort of internalized or replaced theologically.
And for Judaism?
Rabbinic Judaism really came to the fore, emphasizing Torah study, prayer, the synagogue as the center of religious life. It was a fundamental split, a reshaping.
And doctrinally, things were developing too. The Trinity is mentioned as central.
But it wasn't like a fully formed doctrine dropped from heaven on day one. The understanding, the vocabulary words like homoousios from Nicaea that evolved over centuries through debate and reflection, it's presented as a core mystery.
Alongside this internal stuff, they were facing external pressure, right? Persecution.
Yes, increasingly. Sporadic at first, sometimes localized, like under Nero in Rome, but it grew. The Romans were often suspicious. Christians didn't participate in the state cults. They withdrew from some public life.
Seen as antisocial, maybe?
Or even atheistic because they didn't worship the traditional Roman gods. It got much worse, culminating in really severe empire-wide persecutions under emperors like Diocletian in the early 300s.
Okay, now let's bring in another perspective. Some of the material really emphasizes the Greco-Roman world's influence, suggesting it wasn't just a Jewish offshoot.
Right, this view argues that the broader culture, Greek philosophy, Roman religions, myths, social structures, played a really significant role in shaping early Christianity, maybe more than sometimes acknowledged.
What kind of influences are we talking about?
Well, one argument is that certain stories or attributes associated with Jesus have parallels with existing figures and sort of storytelling tropes from that world. They talk about translation fables.
Translation fables, what are those?
It's a term used, drawing on writers like Plutarch, for stories about exceptional heroes whose deaths are unusual, maybe their bodies vanish, or don't decay, suggesting divine favor or even a ascent to godhood.
Like Romulus, maybe? Or Heracles?
Exactly, those kinds of figures. The idea is that these stories often involve the hero's body disappearing, post-death appearances, and ascent to the heavens, common themes in the Mediterranean world.
And the link to Christianity.
The suggestion is that these widely understood narratives might have influenced how the stories about Jesus, especially the resurrection and ascension, were told and understood by people in that culture.
So, less drawing solely on Jewish tradition and more on a shared cultural vocabulary.
That's the argument put forward. It even connects to the Roman practice of apotheosis, deifying emperors after death. There were stories, even supposed eyewitness accounts, of emperors ascending to heaven.
Wow. So maybe the Jesus narratives were tapping into or even competing with these existing ideas about divine status and heavenly ascent.
That's the provocative idea presented, that these concepts were in the air and potentially shaped how the New Testament writers expressed Jesus' ultimate significance. It certainly adds another layer to understanding the origins.
Okay, so that takes us through the very early, often turbulent centuries. Let's move into what's often called late antiquity, the 4th and 5th centuries. Big changes coming.
Huge changes. Emperor Constantine is the key figure here. His conversion, or at least his favor towards Christianity, shifted everything.
The Edict of Milan in 313.
Exactly. Granting legal status. No more hiding. Then establishing Constantinople as a Christian capital. It fueled this incredible flourishing of Christian art, building grand churches. The basilica model becomes standard in literature.
Like Jerome's Vulgate.
The Latin translation of the Bible, hugely influential in the West, and the writings of the Church Fathers, Augustine, Ambrose, Gregory of Nazianzus, shaping theology for centuries.
And this is also when monasticism really takes off.
Yes, starting in places like Egypt and Syria, this movement emphasizing asceticism, prayer, withdrawal from the world, but also, interestingly, community service.
Like Basil the Great, setting up hospitals.
Right, the Messiahs. Early forms of organized charity and healthcare, showing a social dimension beyond just individual piety. That emphasis on charity seems to have been a real factor in Christianity's appeal and growth.
Even as other religions were still around.
Oh yes, it was still a religiously diverse world. But Christianity kept spreading east into Persia, among Arab tribes, Syriac missionaries going way out into Central Asia, even China eventually. And Germanic tribes in Europe were converting too, though often to Arian forms initially.
Which brings us to the theological controversies. It wasn't all smooth sailing internally.
Far from it. The 4th century was rocked by debates, especially Arianism, the argument about whether Christ was truly divine like the Father or a created being.
Leading to the Council of Nicaea in 325.
A pivotal moment. Called by Constantine, it affirmed Christ's divinity, producing the Nicene Creed. But the debates didn't stop there. Arianism persisted for decades.
Until Constantinople in 381.
Which really solidified the Trinitarian doctrine that became orthodox. Meanwhile, in the West, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, was steadily gaining influence.
Helped by things like the conversion of Clovis, the Frankish king, to Catholicism.
Definitely. And figures like Pope Gregory the Great in the late 6th century really enhanced the papacy's prestige and practical authority, especially in Italy.
So, setting the stage for the Middle Ages, what are the key developments there?
Well, in the East, you have the whole development around icons, leading to the iconoclasm controversy, the destruction of images in the 8th and 9th centuries. Very different path from the West in some ways.
And in the West?
You see the development of canon law becoming really influential, shaping secular law too. And think about Charlemagne being crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800.
Huge symbolic moment. Papal authority over even emperors.
It established a precedent, yeah. The church becomes increasingly centralized. Popes gain more temporal power land, political influence, especially with the Gregorian reforms under Pope Gregory VII in the 11th century. He really asserted papal authority over secular rulers.
But this growing difference between East and West eventually leads to a break, doesn't it?
The Great Schism, usually dated to 1054, though the tensions, cultural, political, theological, like the Filioque Clause and the Creed, had been building for centuries. It formalized the split between Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy.
And then come the Crusades.
A really complex period. Started with an appeal from the Byzantine emperor for help against the Turks, but morphed into these large-scale military expeditions to reclaim the Holy Land, driven by religious fervor, political ambition, economic motives.
Had a big impact on Europe.
Absolutely. Shaped European identity, interaction with the Islamic world, and controversially led to things like the system of indulgences, which later became a major point of contention.
The church was also a huge patron of arts and culture during this time, especially later in the Renaissance.
Immense patronage.
Yeah.
Think Michelangelo, Raphael. Much of the great Renaissance art was commissioned by the church or church figures, although some of those Renaissance popes were also criticized for, well, corruption and worldly focus, which fueled later calls for reform.
And sadly, this period also saw increasing hardship for Jewish communities in Europe.
Yes, growing marginalization, persecution, forced conversions, culminating in things like the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, targeting Jews and Muslim converts suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. A dark chapter.
Which leads us towards the Reformation in the 16th century.
A watershed moment, usually pinned to Martin Luther in 1517. But there were earlier movements, proto-Protestants like the Waldensians or John Wycliffe, calling for reform.
And Luther's protest just exploded.
It did, leading to the splintering of Western Christianity. You get Lutheranism, then the Church of England breaks away under Henry VIII.
For different reasons initially.
More political at first, yeah.
Yeah.
Then you have the Reformed tradition, Calvin, Zwingli, leading to Presbyterianism, Congregationalism, and more radical groups like the Anabaptists, later the Quakers, a whole branching out.
And the Catholic response.
The Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent clarified Catholic doctrine, reformed some practices, and there was a renewed missionary zeal, often through new orders like the Jesuits. This era also saw Christianity spread globally in a big way, tied often to European colonialism.
Jumping forward quite a bit, what about more modern developments?
Well, the 20th century saw huge shifts. The rise of Pentecostalism, starting right at the beginning of the century, emphasizing spiritual gifts, divine healing, now a massive global force.
And theological debates continued.
Oh, yes. The tension between modernism trying to reconcile faith with modern science and thought, and fundamentalism reacting against that, emphasizing biblical literalism. And then in the mid-20th century, the rise of the broader evangelical movement, figures like Billy Graham becoming internationally known.
Which brings us more or less to today. What's the picture now?
It's truly a global faith. The demographics have shifted dramatically. Most Christians now live outside Europe and North America and Africa, Asia, Latin America. It's incredibly diverse culturally.
And still the world's largest religion, according to the stats. Often noted that a majority are female and non-white.
That's the current snapshot. A long, complex, often messy, but continuous history leading to this global, diverse reality.
So reflecting on all this history, how can understanding it help someone, in their own faith journey?
I think that's a crucial connection to make. Knowing the context behind beliefs like the Trinity or practices like baptism gives them so much more depth than just accepting them at face value. You see how they developed, what they meant to people facing different challenges.
Like seeing the struggles of the early church.
Exactly. Their resilience, their debates, their failures even. It can offer perspective, maybe inspiration for Christians facing challenges today. It connects you to a much longer story.
And what about the more critical perspectives, like the Greco-Roman influences? Does engaging with that help?
I think it can lead to a more informed, maybe more nuanced engagement with scripture and tradition. It encourages you to ask questions, to understand the world into which Christianity was born and how it interacted with that world. It doesn't have to undermine faith. It can enrich understanding.
Seeing doctrines develop over time, does that change how you view them?
It can deepen appreciation for them, actually. Seeing the thought, the prayer, the debate that went into articulating something like the Nicene Creed helps you grasp its significance. It wasn't just handed down, it was wrestled with.
So the suggestion really is to explore. Maybe look into your own church's history or your denomination's roots.
Absolutely. Connecting with the specific people, events, and theological streams that shaped your particular tradition makes it less abstract. It becomes your story, in a way, part of this bigger narrative. It can definitely deepen that spiritual journey.
It's about seeing yourself as part of that long continuum, maybe.
Precisely. Not isolated, but connected to centuries of believers who came before.
Okay, so just to recap briefly. We've journeyed from Christianity's origins in Judea, seen its interaction with the Roman world, the formation of its core beliefs, the splits and reforms, its global spread, and its incredible diversity today. Understanding that history, we're suggesting, provides really valuable context for faith.
Absolutely. Which leads to a final thought, maybe a question for you, the listener, to mull over.
Go ahead.
Considering this vast, complex history, we've touched on all the different periods, events, ideas, what single aspect, maybe a person, an era, a controversy, really resonates most with you personally. And how might exploring that specific thing further enrich your own understanding of your faith journey and your relationship with Christ?
That's a great question to leave people with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Christian history. We really hope it's given you some valuable insights and plenty to think about.